Let me start by saying this. It's about why I'm here. Why I'm here is, as was just mentioned, my son took his life in 2004, and my wife and myself found ourselves at a crossroads about what that meant and what we were going to do. And so we got very active in doing a variety of things. And really, my slides and my talk, I tried to base around my personal experience. I don't always do that, but given the nature of today's meeting, I thought it would just be better to interject some things about why I'm interested and active in certain areas of suicide prevention. So along the way, I found myself doing work both in my local area, regionally, statewide, and nationally. But in the end, I have really one objective. I've simplified it. My objective is simply save lives. Don't let people take their lives. And we're going to go through and talk a little bit about that. But I will tell you up front, I asked, my slides will get posted. So don't sit there between eating it with one hand and trying to take notes. You'll have whatever I'm talking about today, you'll have. And I've kept the slides sort of simplified to try and make some basic points while covering several topics that I'm interested in. And that's why you might look and say, well, why didn't he say more about X or Y? It's because I don't want to burden you with any particular topic, but I want to make sure I talk about certain things. Now, the reason why I ended up here today is amongst some of the work that I did, I was one of the people who asked that we have statewide initiatives using the Mental Health Services Act money. And because of that, I found myself on various committees because somebody said, you caused this problem, you do something about it. And one of those committees is the one that was mentioned earlier, which is one of the ones that's sponsoring or is on your literature as one of the lead agencies for today, and that's the Student Mental Health Policy Work Group. How many people are familiar with that work group? Okay, because a lot of you aren't, and before you leave here, you better remember that group, because it's there to serve you, and it's out of the California Department of Education. So its end objective is to make sure that they're helping you out, and that's my end objective. Okay, when I was asked to do this talk, I sat down the next morning and I briefly wrote this. And I won't read it all to you, but basically what it says is, when you're somebody who loses a loved one, that's not something you expect to have happened. I didn't get up one morning and realize, I had a child who was going to be at risk. And I also mentioned in here that often it's suggested that parents do something more to recognize the signs in their children as if that's a simple task. I'm a fairly in-tune person, and there are signals that my son gave off, but the fact of the matter is I would have never picked up on him or couldn't. It was just too difficult a situation where it's somebody who you're intimately involved with and you don't think about the fact that they're going to take their lives. So my message to you is to remember this isn't simple or easy. We're asking people to do work around suicide prevention. It's not something that just comes naturally to folks. So this is a quote. I used to use it and then hadn't for a while, and then thought about today's talk and how could I make a quick point. And this is by Carolyn Callahan, who's out of the University of Virginia. She works with gifted children. And without reading it all to you, I would tell you that she basically said that these students, looking at the students today, they're characterized by perfectionism and supersensitivity and put themselves at risk of suicide. So some of the times we don't, I think, reflect on the fact that our young people are at risk. We might see certain things in them, but we don't correlate that with how dangerous a situation it might be. So that leads me to this. I noticed today some people have been talking about suicide. I'm really happy about that because if we don't talk about it, we're not going to do something about it. I gave a talk a couple of years ago to a group that's actually larger than this the people who are attending today. And I started off, it was a gala event, and the agency did more than mental health, but one of the components was mental health, and they asked me if I'd speak, and I said, sure. During that talk, I started it by saying, I'm going to talk about something that most people don't talk about, that we don't really focus in on, and in some ways that's a sad situation because we end up focusing in on it after the fact when there's a tragedy, and we're trying to figure out why and to recover from it. But I also told these folks, because I realized a different audience from today, and I realized they probably didn't know much about mental health or suicide prevention. And essentially what I told them is, denial's not a solution. If you think you're gonna deny something and that's gonna get you to where you wanna go, it's not gonna happen. The only way you can deal with suicide is you have to deal with it directly. So some people have given different data points today. I'm giving you literally what our California database, the Epicenter, shows on 0 to 18-year-olds for the over 20 years of data that they show in there. And we lose about 130 student lives per year. But more important than that is the number of people who, students, young people, who attempt to take their lives, which if you look at this slide, either now or later, just absolutely dwarfs the number of people who die by suicide. What's the point in data? I think this is the point for me. A lot of people use data, and in a lot of cases when they're talking about suicide, regardless of the age group, they say it's just a very small number, that it's 1%. And that's because, what are they doing? They're looking at the deaths. They're not looking at the spectrum of what happens. From the beginning, where people maybe have thoughts of suicide through planning all the way to the end when they lose their lives. They're not looking at, frankly, how the whole community gets impacted. And I'll talk about that briefly again in a few minutes. So the point is this: suicide is, and suicide attempts, everything around suicide in this state is a significant health issue, period. Now I put this in because some of the times people don't know how to characterize folks who have lost a loved one to suicide, and there's actually a label or a title for that, and we call ourselves suicide loss survivors. And I have some of my friends are out here who are in this category with me. And what I ask people to do is get a better understanding about what a suicide loss survivor is actually going through, because they're dealing with a lot of trauma, and there's a whole series of challenges they have to deal with. And when you talk about a suicide and you're looking at the loss survivor, one of the concepts that we've brought up with folks is to think about it as a concentric circle. It's not just the immediate family, whether it's parents or siblings, but it ripples out from there. It has an impact that just goes out in a concentric way and affects lives across the board. I had a person tell me just a couple of years ago, we were at a American Foundation for Suicide Prevention walk, and a person from my community came up to me and she said, you know, I know that your life has been severely impacted by your son's loss of life, but she said, so is the community's lives, that it's had a big impact on people. And some of that has to do with our personal situation, the fact that my wife and I are very active in our community. So understand, when you're talking with somebody who's lost a loved one by suicide, there's a lingering effect. It isn't just the here and now. I mean, you can tell just by even me talking up here, your life is impacted, and it's impacted long term. It doesn't necessarily go away. And when you're working with somebody, or you're in a situation where somebody's lost a loved one to suicide, I think especially you folks that are working in the school communities and maybe have lost a student, you need to learn or understand that you need to work with that family to talk with them about how to communicate. We just had a situation, something came up a couple of weeks ago where, I'll just call it an institution, invite us in. They lost 7 lives to suicide, and they were trying to figure out how to communicate that to not only their school public, but to the parents, including some of the parents are willing to or want to talk about their child and how they lost their lives, but some don't. And we had to work with them to tell them how to work in that situation, because you can't, I think, get involved or disrespect what family members want you to communicate. Now let me tell you my own personal experience. We went to the school, my son was in a school, we went to that school to talk with them about some different things and to try and understand what happened. We were fortunate in the case of some of the people at that school because, frankly, they worked with us. And we produced some good things out of those conversations. But some of the people, their approach was, don't say something bad about my institution, about my school. We're concerned about you out there talking about your son took his life and he happened to be one of our students. In my own approach, or in my own opinion, that was just a very poor way of handling things. But in some cases, I almost thank those people for doing that, because it led us to do more things, to move on, to make sure that other people weren't in that same situation. So if there's a takeaway for you, all of you on this point, it's the fact that if you're in a situation where you have students maybe who have attempted to take their lives or talking about it, or you've lost somebody at your institution, respect the wishes of the folks who've lost a loved one, understand something about what's going on with them, and try and work to communicate with others so that you're helpful, not harmful. So I put up something on pupil suicide prevention policies. Everybody knows, I think now, right, that we have a state law, AB 2246. So that policy is coming out shortly, or in that law it requires that the California Department of Education issue a model policy, and that's going to get issued here shortly. Why am I interested in suicide prevention policies? Somebody might say, well, it's because of his government background, the fact that he was a mayor of a city, and he understands that if you have a policy, then you have guidance and direction, justification, and legitimacy for what you do. And all those things are true. But I got into doing something about suicide prevention policies because, again, I got a call from a school district. There were 3 or 4 of us, and we went out to talk with them. And essentially what they told me was that they have a huge number of cases of students talking about suicide, and several who had attempted. And they weren't sure what to do. Why did that case stand out with me? It was a elementary, middle school. They were talking about very young children. And so in my own case, I've gone through and I've gotten my school districts, 26 of them that we went to and got them to pass policies. Now we're going to have to get them to adjust them because AB 2246 has some additional requirements, but that was the reason for doing it. So how many of you know if your school districts have a policy? So the rest of you, which is the majority of you, I want you to go back to your school districts and make sure that it isn't just implementing AB 2246, it's making sure that you have a policy that fits your community and that people care about that policy, that they do something. So why a plan? Why should you have a suicide prevention strategic plan in your county? So I'm upping it another level. And let me peek. Am I going to run out of time here shortly? So, okay, I'll keep going because I got several other things. So why have a plan? A plan gives you a roadmap, the ability to do something. It's not one piece, it's pieces and parts. It lays out a strategy for you so that you're not just doing something here, you understand the big picture. So in California, as best as I can tell, there are only 4 or 5 counties who have written suicide strategic plans. And we did it in my county partly because a county board of supervisor and the behavioral health director came to me after they had conversations with the school district that left them with an impression that they weren't engaged about doing something about the deaths that were happening at their school. And I think, or I would hope, all of you would go back and ask your local people, why don't you have a plan? And if you need something to give you guidance on how to put one together, you can look at Santa Clara County's Suicide Prevention Strategic Plan, because we put a section in the front intentionally to try and give people sort of a how-to on how to do things. So I'm going to talk a little bit about suicide clusters. Anybody know what a suicide cluster is? Anybody have the definition? I always love, you can tell where the mental health people are sitting. Okay, a suicide cluster, essentially, I'll give you a simple definition because there's various ones, but it's an inordinate number of deaths that occur in a defined, I'll call it a smaller geographical area over a brief period of time. There's nobody in the state of California, nobody in state government that I know of, and I've talked with people who track how many clusters we have. Is difficult as these situations are, and is much trepidation, sorrow that it's caused people, nobody knows how many there are or where they're at or their characteristics that much. I personally track them, and the only way I can do that is by people who call me or ask me something or say, can you do something about this, or what's happening, what can we do? In this slide, I put in a toolkit that people in my area have worked on. Frankly, to be honest about it, my wife's probably spent 40 hours a week for 2 years working on this. But there's a group of people, not just her, who have done that, and I leave you with a link to how to get it. When the model policy comes up, we've already had talks, and we'll create a link to this toolkit that's called the K through 12 Toolkit for Mental Health Promotion and Suicide Prevention. So you'll all have the ability to get at that. And also in this slide, I put in some other links that deal with multiple actions that school administrators can do in response to a suicide cluster. There's some different articles out there. There's frankly been in the last few years a number of quite good toolkits that are put out. What my wife and her colleagues have tried to do is consolidate some of those and give you practical tips about what to do and provide you with letters and different ways of doing things. But again, if I'm looking to you, I can talk all day about a toolkit. I can't get you to use it. So I'm hoping some of you go back. I'm hoping many of you go back and pick up the link to this toolkit and figure out what it is you can do. So the next one I'll go through quickly. Brad's already talked about some of the legislation. What I did on this slide is I gave you some people's email addresses so you can write a letter to them and say you're in support of these pieces of legislation. Why did I pick these two? AB 89, there's some of us in the room who have tried to get this passed for about 4 years now. And if you haven't figured this out, we're not going to quit. Before we're done, this legislation will happen. Why? Why this piece of legislation? And I'm talking about AB 89. Why do we want psychologists be assured that all California psychologists have some training in suicide assessment, treatment, and management? from my perspective, and the reason why I got involved with this is, unlike a whole myriad of things that some of them I've already alluded to that I've done, this one cross-cuts everything. It's not age specific, it's across the age span. It's not geographically specific, it can benefit all of you regardless of if you're from LA or you're from this county. It's not institution specific like a lot of the work that my wife and I have done. It cross-cuts all that. It's a technique, and it's the ability to frankly provide service for everybody. The reason why I got onto Mark Berman's bill, AB 1261, is of a real live example that somebody brought up with me 10 years ago, in which a young student who was a star, and we hear this a lot when you're involved in suicide prevention, it's sort of contrary to what seems like our cultural folklore is about. There was a student, he was a good student, he was socially very popular, and he was a good athlete. He had everything going for him, came from in quotes, an affluent family. He got caught in the student bathroom smoking marijuana. He was called in a pro forma action. He was just expelled from school. I think he was suspended to correct that. Mark's bill focuses more on expulsion, but he was suspended. But they also dropped him from his true love, which was the tennis team that he played on. So basically they said, go home, we'll call you when we think you can come back, but you'll no longer be able to do the thing you're passionate about. He went home and he took his life. So nobody asked him why, given his background, or regardless of what his background was, why did he take, not why did he take his life, why was he in school smoking, at the time, an illegal drug? Why was he on substance that normally isn't considered an acceptable thing to do? There's some simple questions that could have been asked to him, but that didn't happen. And I think, as some of you know, some people, regardless of age again, will use substance, illegal substance, maybe even legal. They'll use it to a certain degree because they're either self-medicating, or in some cases, they're thinking about taking their lives, using it as a form of taking their lives. So asking simple questions don't hurt. So on that last slide, if you look it up, I gave you the names of some people you can write a letter of support to, and that's really all you have to do is in a header in your subject matter, just say, I support AB 89, or I support AB 1261. On communications, quickly, for me, I think communications are, so I'm not a clinician, as some of you probably have followed, so I do what I can do. And to me, communications is critical. It's critical to how we deal with an issue that, again, part of our real problem is there's a barrier for people to seek help because there's a cultural adversity to doing that. And so how we communicate is important, but understand this, and this comes from my own personal experience where I've dealt with school districts, where they say, look, I'm not going to talk to people about what happened, or we're worried about what we're going to send home. I almost frankly laugh in a sad way about that because in some of the deaths that I've been familiar with that have affected one of my children's lives, she's emailed about the deaths within less than 24 hours of them happening. In today's world with social media, while some school administrators might be debating what it is they're going to communicate, if they're going to communicate at all, guess what? It's getting communicated. So the only question becomes this about communications. It becomes, who's going to shape the message? And is that message going to get shaped in a way that's helpful, not harmful? So there's some other things I put down here. And we've done this in some other things, tried to note that be careful with the type of language that you use. There's some proper language, and as some of you know, and the rest of you can easily find out, you can just, there's media guidelines out there that help you with the way that you communicate. Now, there's just a couple of things on this slide, and I'm still doing okay? About 5 more minutes? Okay. Let me just bring up a couple simple points. I've dealt with a couple of school districts where actually I had a guy that I knew very well who was the vice mayor of his city called me up because for the second year in a row, a 13-year-old and another 13-year-old had taken her life, and he wanted to talk about it. And we sat down and I asked him some things about how it had been handled up to date. One of the things that he told me was, well, they invited all of the students into an auditorium, just like we're sitting here now, or standing here now for me, and they just started to address all of the students, like I'm addressing you. And I said, because I already knew probably what was going to happen out of that, I said, what happened then? He said, well, they were dismissed. And I said, well, yes, I understood that. What happened? He said, a good percentage of the students left crying. Don't ever hold a meeting like that, because frankly, it's not helpful. The better way to do it is to break out into small groups so the individual students have an opportunity to talk about what's going on with them, and you can address their needs. What that message told me, when I hear things like that indicator, and that's the way I look at it, I knew that they had no suicide prevention policy, that they had no idea about what to do if a student took their lives. And I mean no idea from top to bottom how to communicate with people or work with their students. Understand, and this is again from personal experience, so again I've been selected, understand that when you're dealing with an immediate death at your school and you call people in like that and you think you've done a great job and you brought in counselors from outside, from Wellness Together, wherever it is, understand that when you lose somebody by suicide, it's a highly traumatic event. It's sometimes called complicated grief. And what does that mean? It means that those people's lives, students and parents, their lives aren't going to just go back to normal in a couple of days. There have been some good studies out there that show the lag effect and where people start to become symptomatic and are dealing with difficulty 3 to 6 months out. So if you're going to deal with something, don't deal with it just in the immediate. Deal with it through a period of time. How many of you know your suicide and crisis hotline number for your county? So most of you don't. I hope you go back and look that up, because almost all of you have one. I carry my number in my wallet. So if I forget it or something happens, a tragic situation happens and I can't think of it immediately, I go out and pull my wallet card out. So I hope all of you at your schools have a crisis communications team, and that they have an understanding about mental health and suicide prevention. I know a lot of schools have a crisis team or crisis response team, but not all of them have somebody who's aware or knowledgeable about suicide and how you have to communicate about it in a different way. So I'm going to go through this next one, I put in something about cultural competency, and I put some different points in here, but here's the main point I wanted to make sure that some of you know, and that is, in my county, for instance, we've put together a peer support team for various cultural and ethnic groups. The reason is we want people who are from the community and know people in the community speaking to them about their issues, because they have a better understanding of it. As I know from a group, a Philippine community, when they were trying to work on mental health in their community, I always remember they're saying to me, they go out and they say to their folks, it's a condition, not a curse. Meaning it's something we can deal with and something that we should address. So if you don't have in your areas peer support, and you talk to your behavioral health departments about this, if you don't have peer support groups that are ethnically and culturally aware, you should ask for that. It will be a blessing in the end. LGBTQ community. I wish I had the time to explain all of this. So let me just say, though there's not good data nationally about how many people in the LGBTQ community actually take their lives, there's good data on attempts. And we know this is a community that's at risk. And we know, as one of the talks I went to earlier, and there's an article that I give you a link to in here, that things around good school climate can be very helpful. So I guess the main point I'd like to make here, and I give you some resources on this slide, the main point is, I hope each of you goes back to your community and tries to work with your behavioral health department and see that they put together a peer support group around the LGBTQ community. If they don't do that, because of time, I can't tell you what I did, but essentially I'll say in the summary form, when my department wasn't going to do that, I called the meeting. I basically contacted the members in the community who were active around mental health and LGBTQ and said, we're holding a meeting. And then I invited my behavioral health department to come. Now what that ended up, what happened from that is they ended up coming on board, and now we've got a grant through that department for a committee that goes out and does direct work, and it's a peer group that works with members of our LGBTQ community. So last thing I want to bring up is, and I'm sorry I have to do this so briefly, how many of you are teachers in here? Or school administrators? Okay. Here's one of the things I try and remind people, and I'll tell you why I try and remind people of this. I've been involved with some suicide clusters, where school suicide clusters, in which, while people are saying to teachers, you have to do this and you have to do that, some teachers have taken their lives. When we get caught up in a tragedy and try and figure out how we're going to work our way through it, some of the times the blinders go on and we don't realize many lives are affected. So as I always say, and I'm popular, by the way, with teachers in my community, I always say that if I understand this correctly, a teacher is a human being. That means they're subjected to the same things that all the rest of us are subjected to, and that we can't ignore that, and that we need to look at things like and make sure that things are provided in the way of giving them anonymous opportunities to talk about themselves, but also to provide them with things like compassion fatigue classes and other things. I think we can, we ask everybody, and notice how I've gone through and maybe said contradictory things here to some of the things that are out there that get talked about. We can ask parents and teachers and others to do a lot of things, but remember they also are having their own lives and maybe their own difficulties to deal with, and you have to take that into consideration. So the last thing I put up here is a quote by Eleanor Roosevelt. From my perspective, I've had a lot of people over the years say no to me about certain things. And my reaction to that typically is, I thank them. I thank them because it just means they just presented me with another opportunity to do something, not to quit, and to make sure that in the end, lives are safe. So, thank you. Thank you for being here and listening to me.